Hello 7th graders, welcome back to Mr. Kendrick's online math class. Today we are going to be doing lesson 1.4, multiplying integers. Make sure you have your math notebook out and you're turned to a brand new page and write the lesson title at the top and write the essential question down below. The question that we're going to be working to answer today is the product of two integers positive, negative, or zero? How can you tell? Okay, remember, a reminder, the product is the result we get when we multiply two numbers. Okay, so when we're multiplying, the answer that we get is called the product. Alright, we're going to start by using repeated addition to find the product of 3 times 2. And recall that multiplication is repeated addition. 3 times 2 means to add 3 groups of 2. Okay, so 3 times 2 can also look like 2 plus 2 plus 2. So we have 3 groups of 2. And let's look at a number line to see what that looks like. Alright, so when we're multiplying 3 times 2, that we're working with two positive integers. So that means that our product, our answer, is always going to be positive because we are moving to the right. We are moving to the right side of the number line. So positive times positive equals a positive. You are always moving to the right on the number line. Okay, so go ahead and pause now. Write these notes down in your math notebook. So positive times positive will always give you a positive product. Alright, now we're going to look at multiplying integers with different signs. So we have a 3 times a negative 2. And just like the last problem, if we say 3 times a negative 2, we can also say that is equal to negative 2 plus negative 2 plus a negative 2. Okay. Now, if you remember our last couple lessons, this could also be written as negative 2 minus 2 minus 2. And if we look at a number line, we have 3 groups of negative 2. So if we start at 0 and we're creating negative number groups, negative 2, we are moving to the left on the number line. So our product is going to be negative. So if we are multiplying a positive number by a negative number, our answer is going to be negative. And the commutative property of multiplication says that the order in which you multiply does not matter. We will get the same answer. So it can be positive times negative or negative times positive. Go ahead and pause here. Get these notes down in your notebook. Alright, quick review. We have found out that a positive times a positive will give us a positive product. A negative times a positive will give us a negative product, as well as a positive times a negative will result in a negative product. But what happens when we multiply a negative times a negative? Let's find out. First, I want to take you through a couple simple problems. We have evaluate negative 1 times 3. Okay, so that can look like negative 1 times a 3. Okay, so that means that negative 1, when we're multiplying by a negative, will give us the opposite value. Remember, when we multiply any number by 1, does not change the value of that number. So 1 times 3 will give us 3. But if we put a negative in front of it, 1 times 3 will give us the opposite of 3, which is negative 3. Okay, so if we look at negative 1 times 5, we can say the same thing. We're going to negative 1 times 5 will give us the opposite of 5, which is negative 5. Okay. Now, if we have our answer is negative 3, what number can we multiply that number by to get the opposite of negative 3? Well, just like above, if you multiply by negative 1, negative 1 times a negative 3 will give you the opposite of that 3, which will result in a positive 3. And same with over here, number negative 5. If we want the opposite of negative 5, what number do we need to multiply? If we multiply by 1, the number will not change. It'll stay at negative 5. If we multiply by negative 1, we will get the opposite of that negative 5, which is a positive 5. So, when we are multiplying two negative numbers, we will get a positive. Remember, multiplying a number by negative 1 is the same as taking the opposite of a number. Make sure you write these notes down in your math notebook. You can go ahead and pause here. So multiplying a number by negative 1 is the same as taking the opposite of a number. Okay, negative times a negative will give us a positive product. Let's take a further look at this. All right, here you'll see a table. We got negative 3 as the constant, which is that first column there. Negative 3 times 3 will give us a negative product of negative 9. Negative 3 times 2 will give us a negative product of negative 6. Negative 3 times 1 will give us a negative 3. Negative 3 times 0 will always result in 0. And negative 3 times a negative 1, again, it doesn't matter the order that you're multiplying in. So negative, if we look at that negative 1, it's going to give us the opposite of that negative 3, which will be a positive 3. And a negative 3 times a negative 2, again, will result in the opposite, which would be 2 times 3 would be 6. Negative 2 times a negative 3 will be a positive 6. So, negative 3 times a negative 2 will result in a positive 6. Alright, so hopefully you can look at this table and recognize some patterns. We can see in this first column, this number is not changing. We're staying constant with negative 3. The middle column is decreasing by 1. So for each row, the middle column is decreasing by 1. And that changes our product to be increasing. So here we are increasing by 3. Here we are decreasing by 1. And here we are staying the same. Alright, let's move on. Here are some examples. I'm going to go through them, and I would like you to write them in your math notebook. Alright, negative 1 times a negative 8. This can also be written as negative 1 times a negative 8. And that negative 1 tells us we are going to get the opposite of negative 8, which will result in a positive 8. Here we have 3 times negative 8. And remember, multiplication is grouping. So we have 3 groups of negative 8. So this can be also written as negative 8 plus negative 8 plus negative 8. And if you remember from our lesson the previous day, this can also be written as negative 8 minus 8 minus 8. Okay, and if we have 3 groups of negative 8, we get negative 24. So 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. All right, over here we have three different integers that we're multiplying. Okay, and again, it doesn't matter the order in which you do them, but for me, I'm going to do the negative numbers first. So we have negative 5 times a negative 2, which will result in a positive 10. So we have 10 times 3, and that will give us 30. Okay, again, you could do them either any way that you would like. You could do 3 times a negative 5, which will give you negative 15, times negative 2, which will give you a positive 30. So here in this problem we had 2 negatives. What happens if we have 3 negatives? Okay, again we'll start with the negative 5 times negative 2, which will give us a positive 10. Okay, and then we'll bring down that negative 4. So we have a negative times a positive, and that will always give us a negative product. So our answer would be negative 40. Okay, go ahead and pause. Make sure you got these problems written down in your math notebook so you can refer to them later. All right, so here's our key idea for the lesson. In words, the product of two integers with the same sign is positive. And you can see 2 times 3 gives us a positive 6. A negative 2 times a negative 3 will also give us a positive 6. Multiplying integers with different signs. The product of two integers with different signs is negative. And you can see down below, a 2 times a negative 3 is a negative 6. A negative 2 times a negative 3, or negative 2 times a positive 3, will give us a negative 6 as well. Okay. Again, you can see right here the communicative property of multiplication says it does not matter the order that you multiply. Okay, so these are good notes for you to write down in your math notebook. All right, go ahead and pause here, complete these problems on your own, and then come back and see how you did. Okay, so we know 5 times 5 will give us a positive 25. Negative 1 times a negative 9, that negative 1 says we're going to get the opposite of negative 9, so we will get a positive 9. 2 times a negative, or 12 times a negative 2, so that means we have 12 groups of negative 2, or you could also say we have negative 2 groups of 12, so we got a negative 24. All right, down here, challenging one, negative 10 times negative 6 times 0. Well, if we start with this negative 6 times 0, any number times 0 will give us 0. And then we have 0 times negative 10. 0 times negative 10 is 0. All right, and lastly, we got 3 negatives here. Let's start with that negative 5 times negative 4. That will give us a positive 20. So we have 20 times a negative 7. 20 times negative 7 will give us a negative 140. All right, hopefully you got the same answers I did. And lastly, we got one more slide to finish up. What do we do with exponents? All right, now this is very important for us because the exponent is very sensitive. It depends on where that exponent is for what you must do. So in this first one, when we have parentheses and an exponent on the outside of those parentheses, that exponent is distributed to everything inside. Okay, so in this situation, we would have negative 2 times a negative 2. And if we have 2 negatives, that would equal a positive 4. So negative 2 squared would be a positive 4. Now, number 2, we have negative 5 squared. There's no parentheses, so that exponent only applies to that 5. So we have a negative out here, and then we have 5 times 5. Okay, so that would be, this negative would just hang out there. It would come down with it, and we'd have 25, so we would get a negative 25, which is very different than a negative 5 times a negative 5. So make sure you pay attention to that exponent and if there are parentheses or not. All right, and lastly, we have negative 4 cubed, or negative 4 raised to the third power. So those parentheses mean that exponent goes to everything inside. So if we rewrite this, it would be negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4. Okay? So if we do negative 4 times negative 4, we would get a positive 16. Okay, and then if we have 16 times a negative 4, that means our product is going to be a negative. So we can bring down that negative. And 16 times 4, well, if we break it down, we got 4 times 10, which would be 40. And 4 times 6 would be 24. So that would give us a negative 64. Okay, hopefully this makes sense to you and you can understand the difference between when we multiply integers with 2 positive integers, 1 negative integer, or 2 negative integers, and the difference in the product. If we go back to our essential question, is the product of 2 integers positive, negative, or 0? How can you tell? Okay. Hopefully you can answer that question based on what you saw in this video, and you can find more information in lesson 1.4 in your online textbook.